But what are the sort of like advantage? Like,
Well, the
if somebody
advantages-
came to you and said, I want to buy a bass, I want you to make me a bass. I'm not sure about active or passive basses.
Right, okay.
What do you think? What's your initial thing
Well,
you'd say to them?
one of the things that we obviously with an active bass, what you can do is you can add.
Yeah.
You can only subtract with a passive. So a passive tone control just rolls off treble. That's all it does.
Yeah.
Also, if you have two volume controls, for instance, like on a jazz bass, when they interact with each other because they load, one is loading the other pickup.
Yeah,
and
yeah.
Everything is interacting with everything else. So you turn one completely off and the whole bass goes off.
Yeah.
So that's the disadvantage to it. There is obviously a sound that you can get from a passive bass because of those things that makes it unique. And we have our ears, a bit like the alder and maple, have got attuned to that. So
Yeah.
with an active bass, you've got various advantages. Obviously, you can add stuff. You can select the frequencies. You can do all that stuff. But you can also, more importantly, you can buffer things so that you can stop things interacting with each other. So you could have one pickup with full treble on and one pickup with full bass on if you had that type of controls
circuit,
on,
yeah.
and they wouldn't react to each other. They just run in parallel.
Are there any disadvantages to active basses?
I don't think so, actually.
Maybe
to
the
be
only
quite
disadvantage
honestly,
is
but-
that you
but
can't get a passive.
You can, well, you
tone
can
now.
because you
But
can
you
have
can
an
now,
active
'cause
passive switching.
Yeah.
One of the really interesting things that we do is to use a passive buffer or an active buffer in a passive bass. So basically, you've got a passive bass.
Active buffer, passive bass.
bass.
Right, carry
So
on.
all the controls, a bit like an old valve amplifier, the tone controls are actually passive.
Yeah.
But obviously there's an active preamp because it's all powered.
Yeah.
And so you using passive controls, but you use it through a buffer preamp, which lowers the impedance, adds a bit of gain. By lowering the impedance means you don't get the loss through the cable. You get a better quality signal.
Right,
And
okay.
we build instruments for a lot of the more old school players who prefer that type of tone control, but
Yeah.
are looking for a much better sound to signal ratio.
Yeah, you know what I was going to say actually, that I
Most
actually,
specific,
and now this is because I'm a bit of a plug in and play kind of guy.
Yeah.
Yeah, and because of that, part of me actually prefers a passive bass, and it's not really, I don't think, because of the sound. I think it's like a mental thing. I just think I just plug in and play.
A really important thing with me, and one of the things that we've tried to sort of develop more. I mean, we work with a guy called John East on our electronics, and John makes a lot of retrofit circuits, which are basically circuitry to go into existing basses that don't sound all that, and it's to hotten them up a bit. So
Is he the guy that did
the J Retro and
J
all,
Retro?
and all
Yeah,
that sort
great
of stuff.
circuits actually.
Yeah,
So check them
yeah.
out if you haven't already. John East.
But John's, because he's putting them into sort of in different instruments a lot of the time, he's trying to add a bit of something, a bit like EMG pickups. So I've got pre-EQ.
Yeah.
That's great on that sort of in that sort of setting. For our sort of situation, I prefer when it's in the middle, when it's flat, it's flat. So
It's
all
flat,
you're
yeah.
hearing is the bass,
The wood.
and the wood of the bass, and the position of the pickup.
Yeah.
Because
As in
obviously
sort of like
you get a
where
lot
it
of
is on the actual
tonal
bass.
difference between one pickup and another pickup, just
Yeah.
because it's the sonic register of the position on the string.
Yeah.
So that's something I think on a good quality instrument, when you don't want a lot of pre-EQ, that in a way solves your problem.
Yeah.
All you want to do, the sound guide, the amplifier, that's got plenty of EQ on it. All you want to be able to do is just make minor adjustments to the room, to the band, to the tune, whatever goes on. The room fills up with people, you know.
Yeah, like I do sort of like prefer sort of like the psychological side to a passive bass, but the actual what happens generally is when I'm working with engineers, is they kind of moan about passive basses a lot of the time.
Yeah.
Like, you know, excess noise, especially with jazz basses and
Yeah.
things like that. You know, I could talk about this for ages, but yeah, which is why I think that active passive.
Well, I mean, it's
buffer
also you
circuit.
combine it with, because as soon as you talk about noise, as soon as you start using actives or amplification within the bass,
Yeah.
you amplify the noise as well as the stuff you amplify the stuff you don't want as much as the stuff you do. So you then get drawn into the whole shielding, hum cancelling, sort of field of operation.
Yeah.
So you get, I mean, our pickups are all wrapped in copper gauze, so they're completely shielded. The single coil pickups have got ghost coils, so that there's a hum cancelling effect.
What's a ghost coil?
A ghost coil is a second coil, a bit like a humbucker. You know,
so they go underneath each other like this.
Yeah, they can be anywhere actually, but as long as they're wired in parallel with the main coil.
I think I've seen this. I think I've seen two bases with a pickup in the back, or something like that. I can't remember who made that.
We do build it all into the same pickup.
Yeah.
But that coil has no magnets and no pole pieces associated with it. So all it's doing is cancelling hum. It's not actually creating sound because it doesn't have any magnetic field.
It's just cleaning it up for engineers.
It's stopping the noise. Yeah, exactly.
This is something that you probably won't, if you haven't worked in studios before, it's like it's a noise that you won't really have heard. Like I'm sure when you plug in your jazz bass, if you put it on the back pickup, and listen to it carefully, you'll hear a buzz. But if you're sort of like aiming at sort of like, working as a professional bass player, when you do get in studios, you will get your ass kicked by engineers more often than not, because you're listening through headphones, and then, you get the dreaded, Scott, there's a bit of buzz on your bass. Just like, oh no. Which is why I generally use active basses in the studio, because it kind of gets rid of that.